The autumn fog settled over Modesto like a shroud that morning in October 2012, thick and impenetrable, the kind that made familiar streets feel foreign and turned neighbors into shadows. By 7:30 a.m., Sarah Martinez had already been awake for an hour, moving through her morning routine with the careful deliberation of someone 8.5 months pregnant. Preparing breakfast, taking her prenatal vitamins, checking her hospital bag one more time. Her husband, Michael, had left early for a business meeting in Sacramento, kissing her forehead before dawn and reminding her to call if she needed anything. Their son was due in 3 weeks. They'd named him already, Adrian Michael Martinez. The nursery was ready, painted soft gray with white accents, a modern aesthetic that Sarah had spent months perfecting. At 9:15 a.m., Sarah sent a text to her best friend Jennifer. "Going for a walk before it gets too hot. Baby's been kicking all morning. Think he's ready to meet the world." That was the last anyone heard from Sarah Martinez. By 6 p.m., when Michael returned home to find the house empty, Sarah's phone going straight to voicemail, her car in the driveway, her purse on the kitchen counter, he knew something was catastrophically wrong. He called the police at 6:47 p.m., his voice shaking with panic that would later be dissected frame by frame on national television. "My wife is missing," he told the 911 operator. "She's 8.5 months pregnant. She wouldn't just leave. Something's happened to her." Subscribing costs nothing, but it tells the YouTube algorithm god that this story matters. The more you hit that button, the louder these forgotten voices get. So comment the city you are watching from if you don't side the bully. Sarah Martinez was 29 years old, a high school English teacher at Modesto High School, beloved by students and colleagues alike. She had that rare gift of making Shakespeare accessible to teenage minds, of turning reluctant readers into passionate ones. Her classroom walls were covered with student artwork and inspirational quotes. She made you feel like your thoughts mattered, one student would later tell reporters through tears. Michael Martinez, 32, was a commercial real estate developer with a growing portfolio across Central California. Handsome, successful, charming. He was the kind of man who remembered everyone's name, who asked about your family, who seemed genuinely interested in your life. Friends described them as the perfect couple, the kind whose Instagram posts made others envious. They'd met 5 years earlier at a charity fundraiser for the local library. Michael had made a large donation. Sarah had been volunteering. Their courtship had been a whirlwind. Engaged after 6 months, married after a year, pregnant with their first child 3 years into the marriage. From the outside, their life looked like a carefully curated dream. But as Detective Raymond Torres would soon discover, the outside rarely tells the whole story. The Modesto Police Department launched an immediate search. Sarah's face appeared on every news channel in California within hours. Her bright smile, her pregnant belly, her husband's tearful pleas for information. Volunteers combed through Dry Creek Park, where she sometimes walked. Helicopters swept over the surrounding farmland. Her phone records showed her last location ping near their neighborhood before the signal went dead. Detective Torres, a veteran investigator with 23 years on the force, was assigned as lead. Something about Michael's demeanor in those first interviews bothered him. Not anything obvious, just a feeling in his gut that he couldn't quite articulate. Michael was cooperative, passed a polygraph test, provided detailed timelines of his day. His alibi checked out. Security footage showed him at his office in Sacramento from 8 a.m. until 4:30 p.m. But Torres had learned to trust his instincts. The first week brought hundreds of tips, claimed sightings of Sarah in San Francisco, Fresno, Los Angeles. Every lead was chased, every tip investigated. None led anywhere. Sarah Martinez had simply vanished from a residential street in broad daylight, 8.5 months pregnant, leaving behind a life that by all accounts she desperately wanted to live. Her family was devastated. Her mother, Elena Rodriguez, moved into the Martinez home to support Michael, to keep vigil, to wait for news that never came. Her father, Roberto, worked with police, organized search parties, handed out flyers until his hands were raw and his voice was hoarse. Sarah was everything, Elena would say through tears at a press conference. She was excited about being a mother. She had no reason to leave, no reason to disappear. Someone took her from us. The question that haunted everyone was simple and terrible. What happened to Sarah Martinez? As days turned to weeks, Detective Torres began digging deeper into the Martinez marriage. What he found was a more complicated picture than the golden couple narrative suggested. Financial records showed that Michael's real estate business was struggling. He'd made several bad investments in the years before Sarah's disappearance, losing significant money on properties that never sold. He'd taken out a second mortgage on their home without telling Sarah. Credit card debt was mounting. And 3 months before Sarah disappeared, Michael had taken out $1 million life insurance policy on his wife. When Torres confronted Michael about the policy, his explanation seemed reasonable. "We were about to have a baby. I wanted to make sure Sarah and Adrian would be taken care of if something happened to me. And she wanted the same security for me and the baby if something happened to her." But it was the timing that bothered Torres. Why 3 months before the birth, when they were already struggling financially? Why $1 million, far more than their actual needs would justify? Torres also discovered that Michael had been spending time with a woman named Victoria Chen, a marketing consultant he'd met through business contacts. Phone records showed hundreds of texts and calls between them over the past 6 months. When questioned, both Michael and Victoria insisted they were just friends, that the communication was entirely professional with some personal friendship mixed in. "Michael was helping me with some real estate investments," Victoria explained. "We talked a lot because I was new to property investment and he was advising me. There was nothing romantic between us." Michael's story matched. Victoria is a friend. Sarah knew about her. They'd even met a couple times. There was nothing to hide. But the text messages, when Torres finally obtained a warrant for them, told a different story. While nothing explicitly romantic, there was an intimacy to the conversations that went beyond professional or platonic friendship. Inside jokes, late-night conversations, Michael confiding in Victoria about stresses in his marriage, Sarah's mood swings during pregnancy, their financial pressures, his feeling of being trapped by impending fatherhood. One text from Michael to Victoria, sent 2 weeks before Sarah disappeared, stood out. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living a life someone else chose for me. Like I'm following a script I never agreed to read." Victoria's response: "You deserve to be happy. Life is too short to live for other people's expectations." Torres interviewed Sarah's friends, looking for cracks in the perfect marriage facade. What he found was more nuanced than he expected. Yes, Sarah and Michael had seemed happy, but Sarah had confided to her best friend Jennifer that the pregnancy hadn't been planned, that she'd gotten pregnant despite being on birth control, that Michael had been distant and strange when she told him, taking several days to show any enthusiasm. She convinced herself he was just processing the shock. Jennifer told Torres, wringing her hands. "But I remember her saying once, 'I think Michael wishes we'd waited.'" She brushed it off, said it was just pregnancy anxiety making her paranoid. But now, Jennifer couldn't finish the sentence. The implications were too horrible. 3 weeks after Sarah's disappearance, with no body, no crime scene, no evidence of foul play beyond the suspicious circumstances, the case began to go cold. The media attention faded. The search parties dwindled. Life in Modesto moved on, though the Martinez case remained an open wound in the community's consciousness. Michael Martinez returned to work. Elena Rodriguez moved back to her own home, unable to bear staying in the house where her daughter should have been preparing for motherhood. Detective Torres continued investigating when time allowed, but with no new leads, there was little he could do but wait and hope. The wait would last 10 years. October 15th, 2022. A construction crew breaking ground for a new housing development 15 miles outside Modesto made a discovery that would reopen the case that had haunted the city for a decade. Buried in a shallow grave on what had once been unused farmland, wrapped in a tarp that had degraded over the years, were the skeletal remains of a woman and her full-term unborn child. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment, based on the state of decomposition and personal effects found with the body, a distinctive necklace, a maternity watch, suggested this could be Sarah Martinez. DNA testing would take several weeks, but Detective Torres, now a lieutenant and nearing retirement, felt the certainty in his bones. The call came 3 weeks later. The DNA was a match. Sarah Martinez had been found. The news devastated Modesto all over again. The hope that somehow, impossibly, Sarah had run away and started a new life, that she and her baby were alive somewhere. That hope died with the DNA confirmation. Sarah Martinez had been murdered, her body dumped like trash on the outskirts of town, left to decay, while her family spent 10 years searching, grieving, hoping against hope. The medical examiner's report provided chilling details. Sarah had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The attack had been violent, brutal. She'd been killed sometime around her disappearance date, likely within 24 to 48 hours. The baby, fully developed and viable, had died with her, denied even the chance of being born. Torres, now leading a dedicated task force to solve the decade-old murder, returned to the evidence with fresh eyes and new technology. DNA samples were collected from the remains, from the tarp, from trace evidence on the clothing that had survived decomposition. Everything was sent to the California Department of Justice's Advanced Forensic Lab. Michael Martinez, who had remarried 4 years after Sarah's disappearance and moved to San Diego with his new wife, was brought back to Modesto for questioning. He expressed shock, grief, and maintained his innocence as he had for 10 years. "I loved Sarah," he told detectives, tears streaming down his face. "I've spent 10 years hoping she was alive somewhere, that maybe she'd had amnesia or been kidnapped and would come home. This is a nightmare. I want whoever did this to pay." His alibi from the day of Sarah's disappearance still held up. Security footage, credit card transactions, witness statements, all confirmed he'd been in Sacramento when Sarah vanished. But Torres knew that didn't mean Michael was innocent. It just meant he hadn't been the one to physically take Sarah from their neighborhood that October morning. The break came from an unexpected source: genealogical DNA databases. The trace DNA recovered from the tarp and from under Sarah's fingernails, where she'd clearly fought her attacker, was entered into CODIS, the FBI's criminal DNA database. No match. But forensic genetic genealogist Dr. Patricia Wong, working with the Modesto PD, took the DNA profile and uploaded it to GED Match, a public genealogy database where people uploaded their DNA results from services like 23andMe and Ancestry.com to find relatives. The DNA sample matched several distant relatives. Over 3 months, Dr. Wong painstakingly built a family tree, working backward from 4th and 5th cousins, following branches, eliminating possibilities, narrowing down the suspect pool. In January 2023, she had a name: Marcus Donovan. Marcus Donovan was a name that meant nothing to Detective Torres or anyone else investigating Sarah's murder. He wasn't a friend, wasn't a family member, had no obvious connection to the Martinez family. A background check revealed he was 45 years old, worked as a general contractor, had lived in Modesto his entire life. He had a criminal record, assault charges from his 20s, a few DUIs, but nothing violent in recent years. When Torres pulled Donovan's phone records from October 2012, something interesting emerged. Multiple calls between Donovan's cell phone and Michael Martinez's cell phone in the weeks before Sarah's disappearance. 7 calls, ranging from 2 to 15 minutes each. When confronted, Michael initially denied knowing Donovan. Then, when presented with the phone records, he changed his story. "Oh, Marcus, yes, I'd forgotten. He was a contractor I hired to do some work on an investment property I was managing. We talked about renovation plans. That was years ago. I didn't remember his name. But there was no investment property. Torres checked every property in Michael's portfolio from that period. None required renovation work. None had any connection to Marcus Donovan. Torres brought Michael in for formal questioning, and this time, 10 years after his wife's disappearance, Michael Martinez's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. "I didn't kill Sarah," Michael insisted, his lawyer beside him. "I loved her. I wanted our life together. I didn't hurt her." "Then explain Marcus Donovan," Torres demanded. "Explain why you lied about knowing him. Explain why you called him repeatedly in the weeks before your pregnant wife disappeared." Michael's hands trembled. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want immunity. I'll tell you everything. But I want immunity from prosecution." The district attorney refused, but they offered a deal. Full cooperation in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table. After agonizing deliberation with his lawyer, Michael accepted. What he revealed over the next several hours would shock investigators who thought they'd seen everything in their years working homicide. "I didn't want to be a father," Michael began, his voice flat, emotionless. "When Sarah told me she was pregnant, I felt like my life was ending. We weren't ready. I wasn't ready. The business was failing. We were drowning in debt. And now there was going to be a baby, more expenses, more responsibility, less freedom." He paused, looking at his hands. "I suggested abortion. Sarah was furious. She said the baby was a gift, that we'd figure out the money, that I'd love fatherhood once the baby arrived. But I knew I wouldn't. I knew this wasn't the life I wanted." Torres felt sick listening to this man talk about his wife and unborn son as inconveniences rather than human beings. "I started talking to Victoria more," Michael continued. "She understood me. She didn't judge. And yes, it became more than friendship. We never physically cheated, but emotionally, I was planning to leave Sarah after the baby was born. I thought I'd do the responsible thing, be there for the birth, then ask for a divorce. Try to co-parent. But then the life insurance policy changed things," Torres prompted. Michael nodded slowly. "My business partner suggested it. Said with a baby coming, we needed protection for our families. He'd taken out a policy on his wife. Suggested I do the same. $1 million seemed like overkill, but he said it was standard. And then you realized what $1 million could do," Torres finished. "I didn't plan it," Michael said quickly. "Not at first. But the idea was there. Sarah dead. Tragically, accidentally. And suddenly all my problems solved. No divorce, no custody battles, no child support. The business would survive with that insurance money. I could start over with Victoria. Clean slate. So you hired Marcus Donovan." "I met Marcus at a bar," Michael explained. "We got talking. When he mentioned he'd done some things in the past, things he wasn't proud of, that he needed money. I was drunk. I said something like, 'Wish someone could make my problems disappear.' He took it seriously, asked how much a problem was worth to me. Michael had met with Donovan 3 more times, each meeting carefully away from cameras, each conversation gradually escalating from hypothetical to real. Michael had paid Donovan $50,000. Money taken from their business accounts, reported as construction expenses, to kill Sarah and make it look like a random abduction. The plan was for him to wait until I was out of town, take her somewhere isolated, kill her, bury the body where it wouldn't be found. Michael said, his voice now completely detached. I gave him money. I gave him her schedule. I gave him everything he needed. Torres had to walk out of the room to keep from attacking Michael Martinez right there. This man had orchestrated his wife's murder, his son's murder, had played the grieving husband for 10 years, and was now confessing as if he was describing a failed business deal. When Torres returned, he had one question. Did you know about the pregnancy when you first contacted Donovan? Yes, Michael admitted. That was the point. If she died before the baby was born, it was one problem, not 2. Marcus Donovan was arrested 3 hours later at his home in Modesto. When confronted with Michael's confession and the DNA evidence, he too agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. His account matched Michael's with additional horrifying details. He'd followed Sarah that October morning when she went for her walk. He'd forced her into his van at knife point in a moment when the street was empty, the fog providing cover. He'd driven her to the farmland where the construction crew would find her body 10 years later. Sarah had begged for her life, for her baby's life. She'd fought, hence the DNA under her fingernails. But Donovan was stronger, and he'd been paid well. He killed her with a blow to the head, buried her hastily, took the money Michael had promised, and went on with his life as if he hadn't murdered a pregnant woman and her unborn child. Did you feel anything? Torres asked him during interrogation. Any remorse? Any hesitation? Donovan shrugged. It was a job. I needed the money. I didn't know her. The casual inhumanity of it, both from Michael who'd ordered the killing and Donovan who'd carried it out, left everyone involved in the investigation shaken to their core. The trial of Michael Martinez and Marcus Donovan began in September 2023, 11 years after Sarah Martinez and her unborn son were murdered. The Stanislaus County Courthouse in downtown Modesto became a straight-up media circus, with reporters from across the country camping out to cover every single moment of the proceedings. Elena Rodriguez, Sarah's mother, now 67 years old and visibly aged by a decade of grief, attended every day of the trial. She sat in the front row, staring at Michael with an intensity that made him unable to meet her eyes. Beside her sat Sarah's father, Roberto, and her younger sister Maria, who'd been just 19 when Sarah disappeared. The prosecution laid out a devastating case. The financial motive, the affair with Victoria Chen, the phone calls to Marcus Donovan, the payment trail, Michael's confession, Donovan's confession, and the DNA evidence that tied Donovan to the murder scene. Michael's defense attorney tried to argue that his confession had been coerced, that he'd been manipulated by police after 10 years of grief and confusion. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. The jury didn't buy it. Donovan's defense was even weaker. His lawyer argued that Michael had been the mastermind, that Donovan was merely a tool used by a desperate man. But the brutality of the crime, the choice to follow through even when faced with a pregnant woman begging for her life, made it impossible to paint Donovan as anything other than a willing participant in murder. Victoria Chen testified for the prosecution, admitting to the emotional affair, but insisting she'd known nothing about Michael's plans. If I had known, if I had suspected for even a moment what he was planning, I would have gone to the police immediately, she said, tears streaming down her face. I will live with the guilt of being part of his motive for the rest of my life. The jury deliberated for 6 days. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty of first-degree murder for both Sarah Martinez and her unborn son, conspiracy to commit murder, and special circumstances that made them eligible for the death penalty. During the penalty phase, Elena Rodriguez was given the opportunity to address the court. She walked slowly to the witness stand, carrying a framed photograph of Sarah from her baby shower, radiant and laughing, one hand on her pregnant belly. "This is my daughter," Elena began, her voice shaking but strong. "Sarah Martinez. She was a teacher. She was a wife. She was about to become a mother. She loved Shakespeare and terrible puns. She cried during commercials and laughed at her own jokes. She was a real person with dreams and hopes and a future that 2 men decided to steal from her. For 10 years, I hoped she was alive. I imagined scenarios where she'd had amnesia, where she'd been held captive but might escape, where she'd chosen to leave but might come back. Those hopes were painful, but they kept me going. And then we found her body, and even that painful hope died. My daughter was murdered by a man she loved, a man she trusted, the father of her unborn child. She was killed not for passion or rage, but for money, for convenience, because her life and her baby's life were inconveniences to be eliminated. I will never hold my grandson. I will never see Sarah become the mother I know she would have been. I will never have another conversation with my daughter, never hear her laugh, never tell her I love her. Michael Martinez took all of that from me, from our family, from the world. And Marcus Donovan carried it out without hesitation, without mercy, treating my daughter like she was nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. I don't believe in the death penalty, Elena continued, and the courtroom stirred with surprise. Not because they don't deserve it. They do. But because I don't want their deaths on my conscience the way Sarah's death is on theirs. I want them to live. I want them to spend every single day for the rest of their lives in a cell, remembering what they did. I want them to grow old, lose their freedom, their futures, their hope, everything they took from Sarah. Death would be too easy. Life in prison, knowing they'll never be free, never have the life they murdered my daughter to obtain. That's justice. The jury, moved by Elena's testimony and the overwhelming cruelty of the crime, recommended life in prison without the possibility of parole, rather than the death penalty. The judge agreed. Michael Martinez and Marcus Donovan were sentenced to life imprisonment. They would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, denied the very freedom they'd killed to achieve. The conviction of Michael Martinez and Marcus Donovan sent shockwaves through Modesto and beyond. The case became a stark reminder that danger often comes not from strangers, but from those closest to us, and that the most charming facades can hide the darkest intentions. Detective Raymond Torres, who'd worked the case for 11 years, retired 3 months after the trial ended. He gave one final press conference before leaving the department. Sarah Martinez deserved better, he said simply. She deserved a husband who loved her, a life with her son, the chance to grow old. She didn't get any of that. But what she did get, finally, was justice. It took 10 years, but we never stopped looking for her. We never stopped believing that the truth would surface. And it did. Torres credited the breakthrough to advances in forensic genealogy. Without genetic genealogy, Marcus Donovan would never have been identified. His DNA wasn't in any criminal database. He would have gotten away with murder. This case proves that science and persistence can solve even the coldest cases. The Martinez case became a catalyst for several important changes in California law enforcement. The Modesto Police Department implemented new protocols for investigating missing persons cases, particularly those involving pregnant women. A demographic statistics showed were at heightened risk of homicide. The case also sparked a broader conversation about the dangers of genetic genealogy databases. While everyone agreed the technology had been crucial to solving Sarah's murder, privacy advocates raised concerns about the implications of using consumer DNA databases for law enforcement purposes. Legislation was proposed to regulate the practice, ensuring civil liberties were protected while still allowing police to use the technology in serious cases. Dr. Patricia Wong, the forensic genealogist who'd identified Marcus Donovan, found herself in high demand. Police departments across the country began consulting with her on cold cases, and she established a nonprofit organization dedicated to using genetic genealogy to bring closure to families of murder victims. "Every case I solve is for the victims and their families," Dr. Wong said in an interview. Sarah Martinez waited 10 years for justice. There are thousands of other victims still waiting. If I can help bring even a few of them home, if I can give their families answers, then this work is worth every sleepless night. For Elena Rodriguez and her family, the conviction brought a complex mixture of relief and continued grief. Justice didn't bring Sarah back. It didn't give them the grandson they'd never meet. But it did provide answers, and answers, after 10 years of agonizing uncertainty, were their own form of healing. "I know where my daughter is now," Elena said 6 months after the trial. "I know what happened to her. I know who took her from us, and I know they're paying for it. That doesn't make the pain go away, but it makes it more bearable. We can finally properly mourn. We can finally start the process of healing, knowing the truth." The family held a memorial service on what would have been Adrian Martinez's 10th birthday. They planted 2 trees in their backyard, a flowering dogwood for Sarah, an oak sapling for Adrian. Friends and family gathered to remember not the tragedy of how they died, but the joy of who Sarah had been and the potential that Adrian represented. Sarah's students, now adults themselves, many with children of their own, shared memories of their favorite teacher. They talked about the way she'd made literature come alive, the way she'd believed in them when they didn't believe in themselves, the way she'd changed their lives. "Mrs. Martinez told me I was a good writer when I was 14 years old and getting D's in every other class," one former student said through tears. "She's the reason I went to college. She's the reason I became a teacher myself. She lives on in every student I teach, every life I touch. That's her legacy." Victoria Chen, the woman who'd been emotionally involved with Michael Martinez, struggled profoundly with the aftermath of the trial. Though she'd been cleared of any legal culpability, investigators found no evidence she'd known about Michael's plans. The court of public opinion was less forgiving. She was vilified on social media, called a homewrecker, and worse, blamed for Sarah's death, even though she'd never met Marcus Donovan and had no knowledge of the murder plot. She lost her job, lost friends, received death threats. The guilt and shame drove her into therapy and eventually to a complete reinvention of her life. 3 years after the trial, Victoria published a memoir called The Other Woman, Living in the Shadow of Murder. In it, she detailed her relationship with Michael, the warning signs she'd missed, the guilt she carried for being part of his motive, even unknowingly. "I didn't kill Sarah Martinez," she wrote in the book's introduction, "but my relationship with her husband created the environment where he felt justified in doing so. I was selfish. I was wrong. I participated in the emotional betrayal of a good woman. And while I didn't pull the trigger or swing the weapon, I am not innocent." book was controversial, with many seeing it as Victoria trying to profit from tragedy. But others, particularly women who'd been involved with married men, found it a cautionary tale about the real consequences of affairs, about the way seemingly private choices can have devastating public impacts. Victoria donated all proceeds from the book to a scholarship fund established in Sarah's name for future teachers. It was a gesture that didn't undo the harm, but acknowledged it, took responsibility for it, and tried to create something positive from something terrible. Jennifer, Sarah's best friend, became an advocate for victims of domestic homicide. She volunteered with domestic violence organizations, spoke at high schools about recognizing warning signs in relationships, and worked to destigmatize the idea of the perfect couple that had made it so hard for anyone to imagine Michael could be dangerous. Sarah and Michael looked perfect from the outside, Jennifer told audiences at her speaking engagements. And that's what makes this so insidious. Abusers and murderers don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like your neighbor, your colleague, the guy coaching Little League. Michael was charming. He was successful. He seemed devoted to Sarah, and he plotted her murder. We need to stop believing that domestic violence only happens in certain kinds of relationships or to certain kinds of women. It can happen to anyone. And we need to trust women when they say something feels wrong, even if everything looks fine from the outside. Sarah's sister Maria, who'd been just 19 when Sarah disappeared, struggled the most with survivor's guilt. She'd been away at college when Sarah vanished, had missed the last few months of her sister's pregnancy, hadn't been there when the family needed her most. In therapy, Maria worked through the irrational but powerful feeling that she should have somehow known, should have saved Sarah, should have been able to prevent the tragedy. It took years for her to accept that Sarah's murder wasn't something she could have prevented, that the blame lay entirely with Michael and Marcus. Maria eventually became a social worker, specializing in helping families of homicide victims navigate the criminal justice system. She understood intimately the trauma, the confusion, the way the legal process could feel alienating and revictimizing. Her work became her way of honoring Sarah, helping other families the way she wished someone could have helped hers. Michael Martinez adjusted to prison poorly. The man who'd cultivated an image of success and sophistication found himself in an environment where none of that mattered. His fellow inmates knew what he'd done, killed his pregnant wife for money. And prison hierarchy has its own moral code. Those who harm women and children occupy the lowest rung. He spent most of his time in protective custody, separated from the general population for his own safety. His second wife divorced him within a year of his conviction. His parents, who'd initially believed in his innocence, eventually cut off contact after hearing the full scope of his betrayal and manipulation. Michael gave one interview from prison, 5 years into his sentence, to a criminal psychology researcher studying family annihilators. In it, he attempted to explain his mindset, though his explanations rang hollow. "I convinced myself Sarah would be better off," he claimed, "that she wouldn't have wanted to be a single mother struggling financially. I rationalized it as mercy. I see now how insane that sounds, how I twisted reality to justify the unjustifiable. But at the time, I'd created this narrative where I was solving problems, not committing murder." The researcher noted that Michael showed signs of narcissistic personality disorder, an inability to empathize with others, a tendency to view people as objects that either served his needs or didn't, a capacity for rationalization that bordered on delusional. Michael Martinez is incapable of genuine remorse, the researcher concluded in her published study. He can intellectually understand that what he did was wrong, but he cannot emotionally connect to the suffering he caused. Sarah Martinez was, to him, a problem to be solved. Her humanity never entered his equation. Marcus Donovan fared even worse in prison. Unlike Michael, who at least had education and could work in the prison library or teach GED classes, Donovan had few skills and fewer prospects. He aged rapidly behind bars, his health deteriorating from years of substance abuse and the stress of incarceration. He gave no interviews. He refused to participate in any restorative justice programs. He simply served his time, day after day, year after year, in a cell that became the entirety of his world. A prison counselor who worked with Donovan for several years noted that he seemed genuinely confused about why people viewed him as a monster. To him, it was just a job, the counselor said. He killed Sarah Martinez the way someone else might fix a car or paint a house, as a task to be completed for payment. The fact that the task was murder, that it involved a pregnant woman begging for her life, didn't register emotionally for him. He's what we call a primary psychopath, someone fundamentally lacking in empathy or conscience. 10 years after Sarah's body was discovered, years after her murder, Modesto held a ceremony to dedicate a memorial garden in her honor. The garden was located at Modesto High School, where Sarah had taught, and featured a bronze statue of a woman reading to a child, symbolizing Sarah's love of literature and teaching, and honoring the son she never got to meet. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds of people, former students, colleagues, family members, community members who'd been touched by Sarah's story. Elena Rodriguez, now 77 and frail, spoke briefly. "My daughter has been gone for 20 years, she said, her voice thin but clear. But she is not forgotten. Every student she taught carries her with them. Every life she touched was made better by knowing her. This garden, this memorial, is our way of saying that Sarah Martinez mattered. Her life had value. Her dreams had merit. And her death, though it took her from us, could not erase the love and light she brought into the world." The ceremony included the reading of an essay written by one of Sarah's former students, now a high school English teacher herself, about the impact Sarah had had on her life. "Mrs. Martinez taught me that words have power," the teacher read, "that stories can change the world, that every person has a narrative worth telling. She lived those beliefs, and she died before she could complete her own story. But we, her students, her family, everyone who loved her, we continue her story. We are her legacy." The Martinez case became required study in criminal justice programs across the country. It illustrated the importance of following financial trails, of not being fooled by appearances, of using new technologies like genetic genealogy, and of never giving up on cold cases. Detective Torres, now fully retired and working as a consultant on cold cases, spoke frequently about the investigation. The key to solving Sarah's murder was persistence, he'd tell aspiring detectives. "We never closed the case. We never stopped looking at new evidence. When genetic genealogy became available, we immediately saw how it could help. And we never, ever believed Michael Martinez's grieving husband act, even when we couldn't prove otherwise. Trust your instincts. Follow the evidence. Use every tool available. And remember that behind every cold case is a family still waiting for answers. They deserve your best effort, no matter how much time has passed." The case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of pregnant women to homicide. Studies showed that pregnancy was a leading risk factor for female homicide, often perpetrated by intimate partners. Sarah's case became a rallying point for better protections, better screening for domestic violence in prenatal care, and better training for law enforcement to recognize the warning signs. A domestic violence organization established the Sarah Martinez Memorial Fund, providing resources for pregnant women in dangerous relationships. Emergency housing, legal services, therapy, job training. In the first 10 years of its operation, the fund helped over 500 women and their children escape dangerous situations. Sarah didn't get help because no one knew she needed it, the fund's director explained. Michael was too skilled at hiding his intentions. But there are other women out there right now who do show signs of being in danger. They confide in friends that something feels off. They notice financial irregularities. They feel controlled or isolated. We want those women to know there's help available, and we want their friends and family to know how to respond when someone reaches out. The fund's work expanded Sarah's legacy beyond tragedy, transforming her story into a tool for prevention, for education, for saving lives that might otherwise be lost to the same kind of calculated domestic violence that took hers. Subscribing costs nothing, but it tells the YouTube algorithm God that this story matters. The more you hit that button, the louder these forgotten voices get.